I'm joined today by Mark Piccarreta of Kearney. Mike, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Mike, what vulnerabilities have you seen that have been exposed in the healthcare supply chain in its attempts to cope with national emergencies as a result of this pandemic?
Yeah, I think we've seen quite a few vulnerabilities in the supply chain. I think some of the ones that are, kind of clear in people's minds, at least early on, are things that are more in the medical gloves, masks, and ventilators early on. And then also, in addition to that, a lot of life science companies have, spent a lot of time trying to strengthen some of their supply access to APIs, intermediates to their pharma supply chain. But I think today what we're seeing is some of the most critical things are really on the supplies, and the way that's impacting both the healthcare supply chain and manufacturers is significant. For instance, you're seeing a reduced number of surgeries, focus really on emergency care because there's just not supplies in terms of gloves and masks that would allow them to do and perform OR surgeries.
Yeah. I assume that these have exposed vulnerabilities that were there all along, but maybe they either didn't realize it or they just decided they could get by with it. But when a pandemic happens, boy, those become a lot more serious, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what supply chain is, I would say, relative to other industries, it is one of the more resilient supply chains that you'll see. There's a lot of investment to make sure that there's adequate supply and reliability in the supply chain. If you think about the profitability of the products and the size of some of these drugs and devices, but something like this with such a huge spike in demand, and then also tied to that a shutdown of access to critical supply, whether that be manufacturing issues early on coming out of China and Asia, or also in some cases on some of these critical supplies. We are seeing things like export bans that put additional strain on the supply chain.
Yeah. And the usual regulatory hurdles are there as well. Are those compounded now, getting even worse, or is that just part of what the industry has always had to live with?
To a degree, the industry has always been more insulated, I'd say, from the outside environment because it has such a heavy regulatory, burden tied to it, and then also the level of investment required in innovation. I think what we've seen now is really two things. We've seen in some cases the easing of regulations to allow more supplies in. So if you think about on the mask supplies, being able to use construction masks versus FDA approved masks in certain applications. That would be one example. The other one is also expediting clinical trials on certain key drugs.
Yeah.
So in some senses, that's gotten better. On the other hand, we see some constraint in supply where countries are putting export bans or constricting supply and keeping it for their use, which is increasing regulatory burdens.
Well, that must be a big challenge for them too, because the sourcing is changing too, as a lot of other types of manufacturers are gearing up to actually make things like masks and the like. That means that traditional areas of sourcing are changing. So I would think that the supply chains would have a big challenge making that pivot.
Yeah, for sure. We see in certain applications, new entrants into the market, whether that be non-traditional players like Ford or GM helping to make ventilators, or others making antiseptics, both for their own manufacturing purposes and also for sale. And then also on the medical supplies and masks, a lot of companies pitching in to help do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about what supply.
Happen, and then there's certain barriers.
Go on, finish. Yeah.
Yeah, you can do that for easier to manufacture supplies and devices, but once you get into more complicated drugs or medical devices, it becomes a whole lot harder to have that level of substitution.
Right. Well, what should supply chain executives in healthcare be doing right now? I know that you propose a number of steps, one of which is to conduct a proper post-mortem of the crisis. In other words, kind of look back to see how we got to this state of affairs in the first place. What would such a post-mortem consist of? How would it be carried out?
Yeah, what we're talking to our clients about is how they both learn from the things they've done really well in this crisis and then the things that have not gone so well. So The things that we're finding people have seen work well are the way they've operated and made decisions in this crisis has been at a much faster pace, and have been able to get to the right decisions quicker than their traditional operating model. So there's certain elements of that folks really want to keep in the way that they operate and run their supply chain. The piece that is requiring more focus is really around the resiliency and reliability of their supply chain. So asking the questions on what are the critical materials that have really impacted my finished good production and getting it out the door, which suppliers, whether they were strategic or not strategic, have really performed in this crisis or have let us down, and how do we rethink our supply chain based on that. And then also, have I invested enough in supplier development? So in a lot of these spaces, they're developing suppliers, and have they really put the emphasis needed in that space, or is there more to be done? And then lastly, in this space, there is a lot of planning for business continuity for reliability issues. But did they plan for this type of scenario? And are these types of scenarios where you have a massive surge in demand in critical materials, and then also governments acting in ways they don't typically act? Are you prepared to handle that type of stress in the future?
Yeah. Other types of manufacturing tend to have alternatives where they can go to other parts of the world where they can get supplies when suppliers in a particular geographical region go down. I would think that because of its very highly specialized nature, the healthcare industry would have fewer alternative sourcing strategies. Once they get a supplier, because they have to be so specialized, the options are not quite as varied. Is that the case?
Yeah, in this industry, what you'll see is a lot more sole sourcing of supply, and then where risk has been identified, there'll be multiple sources of supply lined out and available. Now, the problem becomes if those sources get tapped out, it is very hard to switch supply quickly if the supplier is not qualified, either from a validation standpoint or re-registering a product if you're making it a new location. So a lot of this has to be pre-planned and orchestrated in terms of points of supply. It's much harder to switch on a dime if those sources of supply dry up.
You talk about the need to engage customers to identify so-called core requirements and to rebalance priorities and the like. How is that exercise happen? I mean, tell me a little bit more about how you can approach your customers and how they can actually help supply chains to improve in that way.
Yeah, there's a couple ways that we're seeing that are kind of naturally occurring now. I think one, supply chains in general have gotten, been a much more deliberate about getting close to the customer, over the last 5 years or so, and in the life sciences and health space. I think what we're seeing in crisis is, more collaboration around thinking about inventory placement, allocations, and communication around demand signals. The other one that's been very interesting that's come out of this is also coordinating with your customers on which are the really critical SKUs to have. Obviously SKU complexity to a degree, it reduces the amount of capacity you have, creates, issues with reliability in your supply chain. And now customers are making a much more deliberate decision on which are the critical things we need, in what form, and how can I, jointly work with you to increase capacity and efficiency between us.
Where does technology come into it? How can these companies invest more in digital and manufacturing technologies to improve their supply chains, make them more responsive, make them more resilient?
Yeah, I think one critical area is really around demand visibility and sensing of supply across the supply chain. So I know early on in the crisis, we had a lot of clients who were pulling their teams, doing a lot of manual calls to China. Anyone who spoke Chinese, how do I get on the phone and talk to my suppliers? Then talk to their suppliers and manage the logistics. More mature supply chains have better connectivity into the supply base in terms of data transparency and visibility, and doing less of the manual calling to really manage that supply base. I think the other thing that we're seeing is if the question comes up around some of these critical supplies, around the need to localize production, right? A lot of these will become more of a national security concern. The question may be in the future, which things need to be produced locally, even in Western markets that they may not be made today? How do you leverage technology in a more efficient plant so that the labor cost trade-offs you may be making by moving it back or reshoring some of this stuff, how does that help you able to do that?
Yeah. So in the healthcare supply chain going forward, what do you think recovery is going to look like? What is the new normal going to be? You just suggested to me that maybe supply lines will be a little bit more shorter, a little bit more domestic, but tell me a little bit more about what that might look like on a permanent basis.
Yeah, I think one element for sure will be, a higher degree of localization for critical supplies, and that, rewiring a supply chain that is this complex and multi-tiered is not something that can be done overnight and can't be done completely. But I think, governments are going to have a larger role in looking at what is critical to their infrastructure and what really needs to be addressed locally, versus foreign, and a reshaping of the supply base, to really enable that. The other one is, I do think, on the rebound, there may be some hard decisions in some place, some of our clients, specifically in the medical device space, where certain elective surgeries over the next 9 months or whatever may have a lot less demand because the ORs just aren't able to spend the time on those types of procedures, and they may have to make hard choices in terms of capacity to right size that. And then lastly, I think people will be much more strategic coming out of this in terms of how they think about their supply base and really how they think about business continuity planning in a accounting for a new type of risk that really wasn't seen or thought of before.
For the healthcare supply chain to learn some lessons from this disaster and this pandemic going forward, maybe be a little bit better positioned to respond to future such incidents. So, Mike Piccarreta from Kearney, I want to thank you very much for helping us to see just what direction healthcare supply chains might go in the future. Thank you very much for being with us today.